Can an initiative by Algeria end the crisis in neighboring Niger? The Algerians are proposing a 6-month transition period from military to civilian rule, while other countries are threatening coup leaders with military intervention. So, how much leverage does Algeria have to push its initiative forward? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoum. The political crisis in Niger is turning into a growing problem for neighboring countries, among them Algeria. The coup last month in Niger has unleashed fears of fighting spilling over its borders and reinforcing armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda across the troubled Sahel region. Algeria is proposing a transitional government in Niger to avoid military intervention by some of Niger's neighbors. But leaders of the coup say their support is growing stronger and louder at home. So, will Niger welcome Algeria's plan? And can sanctions force all parties to the negotiating table? We'll explore these issues and more with our guests in a moment. But first, this report by Katia Lopez-Odayan.
It's been 5 weeks since Niger's President Mohamed Bazoum was deposed by his presidential guard. International calls to reinstate him have grown, as well as threats of a military intervention to make that happen. Algeria wants to avoid military action in neighboring Niger and is proposing a plan for a transitional government.
There must be participation and consent from all parties in Niger. No one should be sidelined. These arrangements should not exceed 6 months. They should happen under the supervision of a civil authority led by a mutually agreed figure. It must include the approval of Niger's wider political spectrum as a way to restore constitutional order in the country.
General Abdurrahman Chiani, who led the coup, wants a 3-year period before restoring civilian rule. The threat of a military intervention from the ECOWAS regional bloc of West African states has apparently done little to deter him. Despite a blockade and sanctions against Niger, neither side has budged, and neither wants to look weak.
It is not in anybody's interest, certainly not in the interest of any African country in this bloc. So they don't have a choice. Now, the junta have said they're giving it 3 years. All ECOWAS can now do is to negotiate a shorter timeline.
Despite support rallies at home, concerns are growing abroad. Neighbors like Algeria fear fighting in Niger could spill over the border, threatening more instability and a humanitarian crisis.
Sanctions put in place by ECOWAS don't include an exemption for humanitarian aid. So there is no exemption right now. There is no way to bring humanitarian aid into the country.
Fighting in Niger could further destabilize the region and bolster armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIL operating in the Sahel region. As the political instability in Niger goes on, neighboring countries, including Algeria, hope diplomacy will outweigh plans for military intervention. Katia Lopez-Odayan for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In London is Alexis Akwajiram, managing editor at the news website Semaphore Africa. In Abuja, capital of Nigeria, is Kabir Adamu, managing director at Beacon Consulting. That's a security risk management and intelligence provider in Nigeria and the Sahel region. And in Saint-Malo in France, we have Jacques Galland, senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute think tank. A warm welcome to you all. And thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Kabir, let me start with you today. From your vantage point, does this initiative by Algeria to end the crisis in Niger actually have a chance at succeeding? I mean, do you think that the coup leaders in Niger would welcome Algeria's plan?
Thank you. So from the side of ECOWAS, it appears to me that this is an opportunity for a soft landing. Since the July 26th coup d'etat, ECOWAS' attempt to find a solution, as it were, and to restore democratic constitutional order in Niger has more or less failed. And ECOWAS is at a point where it's looking weak. The last statement that came out of the chairman of the ECOWAS Commission did indicate that ECOWAS would contemplate some form of transition program. And so if Algeria is coming up with this shorter period than the one that was put forward by the junta in Niger, then it's most likely that ECOWAS would listen to this, although there are several determinants that would be at play. For instance, the position that the chairman of ECOWAS, that the Nigerian president, has taken, the insistence, for instance, on a military intervention, and the fact that the junta itself has consistently not proven to be a trustworthy party in negotiations like this. So all of this would determine how ECOWAS, I would say, respond to this Algerian solution that has been put forward.
Alexis, Kabir there was talking about ECOWAS, the regional bloc of West African states. And I want to ask you a similar question. From your perspective, how seriously will the Algerian initiative be taken by ECOWAS? And how much weight does Algeria carry in all of this?
I think this will be taken extremely seriously by ECOWAS. I think it's exactly right that this is offering a soft landing, because ultimately, ECOWAS does not want to follow through on this suggestion of military intervention, and equally, ECOWAS doesn't want to seem weak, so it's in a really awkward position, and this offers an opportunity. Now, it will be taken seriously because Algeria shares a border with Niger, so this is Algeria offering a solution, and Algeria has a plausible reason to actually care and follow through. So that really helps, because then they can be a decent broker between the position of ECOWAS, and then they don't necessarily seem to be aligned to France, but they do care, because Algeria has said repeatedly that it would not support any form of military intervention, and it's in their best interest, because they do not want this to escalate. They do not want any form of necessary conflict, any kind of unnecessary action and conflict on their doorstep.
So Jacques, Kabir and Alexis have been talking the last few minutes about how ECOWAS will react to this proposal by Algeria. But let me ask you, how likely is it that France would sign on to this initiative?
I think France would support it already, because for two reasons. First, President Tebboune of Algeria and Macron get on well, in spite of the conflicts that they have over many issues, but they get on well, they often speak. And they already, a few years ago, in their last meeting, when Tebboune and Macron met, they talked about the role that Algeria should play in stabilizing the situation in the Sahel. And France thinks that in that case, Algeria would be an honest broker, because Algeria, as was said, has a big border with Niger, and Algeria certainly doesn't want to have a war on its doorstep. There's already Algeria is very concerned about the trouble in Mali and in Niger. They are very worried about the jihadist group. Don't forget that Algeria suffered in the 90s from radical Islamists with the FSC. So they are very sensitive to that issue. And they think that a war in that region would benefit only the jihadist group, who could take advantage of the fact that the Nigerian army, for example, will be busy repelling invaders and so on. So, and they've already noticed that in a country like Mali, the jihadist progress is very strong since the French have left. And another point also is that Algeria has very good relationship with Russia. 90% of the military equipment in Algeria is from Russian origin. So they really think that Algeria would be the ideal country to try to bring a solution, a negotiated solution to this imbroglio in Niger.
Kabir, if we are considering France's role in all of this going forward, we have to mention that the coup leaders in Niger have accused ECOWAS of being in France's pocket. So I want to ask you how much that has the potential to complicate all of these efforts to come up with a diplomatic solution.
So already we've listened to reactions from civil society organizations that are actually close to the junta in Niger to this development. Most of them criticizing the development, suggesting that Algeria is standing on the fence. Just like has been mentioned, Algeria has maintained a neutral stand. It's said clearly that it does respect democratic governance, and to that extent, it's supportive of President Bazoum. But it has also given this leeway, as it were, to the junta to allow them a transition period for say 6 months. So civil society organizations are condemning this stance. They would have preferred a situation where Algeria, supports the junta, especially with regards to the junta's strong stance against France. And I think this is the deciding element. Most Nigerians are united, as it were, regarding their condemnation of France's post-colonial policies. And so that's the very tricky line that Algeria will have to play. Now, how it does that vis-a-vis ECOWAS' desire to restore democracy and to continue the coup wave that is going through West Africa would be a very difficult balancing act. But like has been mentioned, Algeria has all the credentials to play that role. If it's supported by other regional powers, the US, France as an example, which sadly will have to play a very a backseat and not a forward position, as it were.
Alexis, Niger's coup leaders have called for a transitional period that lasts, I believe they said, at most 3 years. And I want to ask you about this because Algeria's plan mentions a 6-month transitional period. So when it comes to that specific point of contention, would the coup leaders in Niger potentially agree to a shorter timeline when it comes to transition?
I think it's entirely possible that they would agree to it. I think their opening offer of a 3-year period of transition is a negotiation position. They are looking at where they can start from and then maybe reduce from there, but they want it to be as ambitious as possible. I mean, I think we should always keep sight of how this all started. This was an opportunistic coup whereby it appears that the head of the presidential guard was going to be pushed out. So then from there, it has snowballed and they're in this position. But, I mean, ultimately, they'll want to find some kind of middle ground. So I don't think they'll necessarily be ideologically driven and believe that they have to push through on 3 years. And then at least they can find some form of compromise solution. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that these sanctions that are being imposed on Niger are going to keep on biting. It's not going to get easier, so they will want to resolve this because on several indices, Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, the price of goods, particularly foodstuffs, is going up constantly. Food inflation is going to go through the roof. It is already. And then electricity has been shut down as well, electricity coming from Nigeria. So that's all going to increase the pressure on the junta because over time, support for them will wane. So they'll want to wrap this up. And that's why I don't think they're going to stick to it has to be 3 years when they could compromise and move closer to the 6 months being suggested by Algeria.
Jacques, I want to step back for a moment and look at another complicating factor when it comes to France's role in all of this, because the coup leaders in Niger gave France's ambassador to Niger 48 hours to leave the country, but President Emmanuel Macron announced that the ambassador will remain in Niger. So from your vantage point there in France, I mean, how much does that have the potential to make the situation potentially worse going forward?
France has a wait-and-see attitude in that matter. They don't want to give in to the junta. They're capitalizing on the fact that maybe the population will begin to get worried about the impact of the sanction, as the previous speaker said, because there's a humanitarian crisis is developing there. There are some dissensions, apparently, in the junta. Not everyone agrees on the way forward. They also will propose, point the fact that this coup was a bit strange because the situation in Niger under President Bazoum was getting better in economic and security terms, and he was democratically elected. So they think that maybe the people in Niger will ask, what is the junta bringing to the plate? What is it giving me? What is it offering me? And we don't see anything that the junta could provide except surfing on the populist anti-French feelings which has been actually activated and promoted by Russia in the region. So what are they giving? And in that sense, the idea that they have chosen. I was surprised. I thought that maybe the junta would want a shorter transition period. And that's why I think they should agree on the 6 months period, because they have now, they are immediately appointed a new president, President Lamine Zain, who is a reasonable person, well known in economic and Western circles, who inspires confidence. So I think that responding to the demands, the reasonable proposal made by Algeria would preserve. Otherwise, I think they will face a rebellion. We don't know. Niger is a bit close. We don't know the feelings of the population exactly. We don't know what's happening. We know what's happening in Niamey. But I looked at the big meeting in the stadium there. The stadium wasn't full. So we don't know whether they're riding on a wave of popular support or whether what's happening in the country. And from where I stand, I can't say.
Alexis, I saw you reacting quite a bit to what Jacques was saying there, and it looked like you wanted to jump in, so I'm going to go ahead and give you that opportunity.
Well, I mean, I was just saying, ultimately, yes, it's clear that the sanctions are going to increasingly bite. And I think at the moment, what the junta has done is they've ridden a wave. They've ridden a wave of popular anti-French sentiment and, more broadly speaking, anti-Western sentiment. But the window of opportunity is closing for them. And with time, these sanctions are going to bite more and more. And there is a danger that the people of Niger will turn on them because life is getting hard. It's also clear that Bazoum was doing well when it comes to fighting the Islamist insurgents operating in the country, those insurgents that are loyal to both Al-Qaeda on the one hand, and then also those who are loyal to Islamic State. So with time, the longer the junta stays in power and the more you see the sanctions biting, people's quality of living really going down, and then they have problems with the insurgents, then it gets harder and harder for the junta. Now, we've seen that with Mali, for example, they found it increasingly difficult to deal with their insurgencies. So it's likely that the junta will take a leaf out of the book that's happened with Mali and just think about how they can find a solution, find some kind of path to accept some kind of compromise solution.
Kabir, both Jacques and Alexis mentioned in the last few minutes the anti-French sentiment in Niger. I want to ask you, where was anti-French sentiment in Niger before the coup compared to where it is now?
I mean, it was palpable before the coup, and I operate in Niger, and you could feel that wave. And just to correct the point, it's not specific to Niamey; it's all over the country, and it's the existence of the average Nigerian, the level of poverty, the deprivation that he or she goes through. And then thirdly, the role of the social media that has portrayed life in France, as it were, compared to life in Niger, and not necessarily the contribution of bad governance in Niger and perhaps even in surrounding countries that may have impacted on that. All of what the propaganda, the misinformation, the disinformation pointed to was the role of France, especially in the extraction of minerals and the so-called sharing formula around that. So it was palpable. Now, what the junta did is they realized the enormity of that resentment, and they've been riding on it. I think a previous speaker spoke around that. And that has been what has really sustained them. The unison around most Nigerians is this fact that the junta, so most Nigerians are not seeing the coup as an opportunistic coup. They are seeing it as a rejection of France's post-colonial policies in Niger. And I think going forward, this is what the junta has tried to put ahead and make sure they rally support around. Yeah, I mean, there are pockets of resistance here and there, but sadly, you're not hearing them.
So, Kabir, let me also follow up with you, because you're talking about the junta in Niger utilizing anti-French sentiment to their advantage. Leaders of the coup there also say that their support is growing stronger at home. How much support do you figure they actually have in Niger? Where does public opinion stand as far as you can tell?
So there are indicators that would tell us where we are. Immediately after the coup, in the public spaces, the stadium in particular, where protests were being held, you would see the stadium full to capacity. Now, the 1 month marking, as it were, of the coup, which was on August 26th, that stadium was not full. And it may be a reflection of the effect of the sanctions on Niger. It may be a reflection of the reality of the average Nigerian. There are two factors that have emerged: the effects of the sanctions, economic sanctions, and then the inability of the junta, as it were, to improve on security. We've seen several attacks in parts of Niger by insurgent groups, and sadly, the Nigerian military has suffered from those attacks. So most Nigerians are beginning to ask that question. Now, at the moment, there are several narratives that have come up. Some, of course, riding around this anti-French sentiment are supportive of the junta, but another group is also saying, look, what has the junta brought on board? All we're seeing is the effect on the sanctions. They've not put forward any alternative position, especially in terms of how they intend to manage better the resources that Niger has. So clearly, the support that they've generated at the beginning of the coup is beginning to wane. How far that go and what pressure it will add on them, only time will tell.
Jacques, let me ask you about one more specific part of the initiative by Algeria. Algeria says that they would also seek a United Nations conference to restore constitutional order, propose guarantees for all sides in the crisis, and to host a conference on development in the Sahel region. Is that something you can actually see happening going forward?
That would be nice if it could happen. I don't know whether it can be done with everyone, because in this region there's so many. This region has become a playground for kind of the struggle between regional powers, and also we know that the whole of Africa, not just the Sahel, is seen as a treasure chest, and everyone wants a piece of the action there. All the world powers are present there. So could you have a conference where everybody comes to the table feeling genuine, with a genuine desire to solve the situation? I'm not sure. Especially, there's also another dimension to the conflict, is the anti-West dimension, which is being played out there. There's a challenge all over the world. We saw the reaction of many African countries to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You can see that there's a growing challenge in the rest of the world, not just in Asia, in South America, to the Western order as it was established after World War II. So the fact that could they adopt a multilateral, well-meaning approach, I'm not too sure in the current climate, because it seems that the role of many powers seems to be to want to destabilize the Sahel rather than stabilize it.
Alexis, I want to ask you more specifically about how concerned Algeria is about the potential of spillover of violence from Niger if a military confrontation takes place going forward. I mean, how much could fighting in Niger destabilize the region, and how much might it bolster armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIL that operate in the Sahel region?
Oh, it could massively destabilise the region. I think that's why Algeria is taking this so seriously. I mean, the longer this goes on, and if there was any form of conflict, any form of military intervention, the only beneficiaries would be the insurgents. Because already we've seen this in Mali and in Burkina Faso, and we're seeing it in Niger. Their armies are already stretched. And Nigeria's army is stretched as well. Nigeria's army is stretched with internal issues around so-called banditry, kidnap for ransom in the northwest, their long-standing Islamist insurgency in the northeast, and various other conflicts such as secessionists in the southeast. So if all of those armies were involved in some kind of military intervention, some form of conflict, they're all being distracted, they're already stretched, and the insurgencies will only get worse. And Algeria realises this. And Algeria already has the bitter experience of seeing the spillover from the fall of Gaddafi in Libya and NATO's intervention there. So they know that no good ultimately will come of this. It will only destabilise the region. It won't make the region any more stable. And that's why they're taking it so seriously.
And Kabir, if we're talking about destabilization and spillover of violence, we must also mention the humanitarian aspect to all of this. And I want to ask you, from your vantage point, what kind of humanitarian crisis might we see if fighting does break out in Niger?
The UN has spoken already around that. I think the last statement by UNICEF indicated that about 2 million children would be at risk of starvation already. And this is just because of the effect of the sanctions on Niger by ECOWAS. Now, if this degenerates into a war, a military intervention, you can imagine the impact it would have on the 25 million population in Niger, plus the several refugees and others from Nigeria and other neighboring countries that are in Niger. I mean, we're already monitoring reports, which is a little bit strange, that in spite of the circumstances in Niger, you still have refugees from other countries coming into Niger at the moment. So clearly, the humanitarian consequence of the military intervention is going to be huge in a region that is already suffering from different conflicts.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Alexis Akwajiram, Kabir Adamu, and Jacques Reland. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.